Hi all, let's have a look at another interesting game from the recent super final between Leela and Stockfish. So TCEC season 15, this is in round 88. Let's have a look. E4 from Leela, G6, D4, Bishop G7, C4, so this can steer to King's Indian territory, D6, this is the end of the book given to both. Knight C3 is the first move Leela plays here. Knight F6, Bishop E2. This looks like a classical approach to the King's Indian. Bishop E2. Black castles, Knight F3. E5. White castles. Another trendy Knight A6. This has become popular in recent years as an alternative to Knight C6. We have Bishop G5, H6, Bishop E3, and now a funny variation, Knight G4. So the bishop gets kicked, and this has been seen in Grandmaster games, so not just these two doing this. Knight G4 again, testing, Knight F6, and now a new move, Rook E1, so not having a repetition, Rook E1. At Grandmaster level here, there's a game, Boris Gelfand against Grishuk in Beijing 2013, which saw C6 being played here. And eventually, Boris Gelfand won that game. It was a pretty hard, difficult game, won in 64 moves. So here we see B6, so this is an innovation from Stockfish. It does weaken, you could argue, some light squares. Is it worth it, these light squares being weakened a bit more? Bishop F1, Knight H7, H3, E takes D4, Knight takes, Knight G5, Bishop E3, Knight C5. So Stockfish is arranging quite a lot of pressure on E4 here, and of course the rook can come and put more pressure, and of course the bishop can also gang up on E4. So this is Stockfish's evil tactical plan, basically. What downsides does it have? What can we speculate, at least? We might not fully understand, but what can we kind of visually speculate? Is there going to be some punishment on the light squares which have been compromised by Stockfish? We see F3, a supporting move, and it looks as though we have that Maroczy bind. The pawns on C4 and E4. Often Leela does well in this kind of structure. However, Leela is also compromising, you could argue, some dark squares. We see A5, which supports the knight against B4, so the knight is now perched, it seems, but at the cost of the B5 square. And in this structure, if C6, sometimes D6 is weak, there's frontal pressure on the D file to factor in. We see Knight DE2, Knight GE6, Queen C2, Rook E8, Rook AD1. So white looks comfortable, but so does Stockfish in a way. So Bishop B7, B3. We see H5. This looks very aggressive and it's pretty committal, surely. A3, as though B4 is coming anyway against that knight on C5. The knight moves in advance of that, it seems. Knight B5 is used. This rings a bell with me. As a junior, there was a lecture by John Nunn, Grandmaster John Nunn, and he mentioned one of his games against Victor Korchnoi where he was playing on the black side, and after Knight B5, he was in a kind of bind. It was only through tactics later he generated significant counterplay and managed to beat Korchnoi with the black pieces. Usually Korchnoi against the King's Indian is an absolute killing machine statistically. So that was a very interesting game, which I vividly remember. But he did mention that he made this kind of positional blunder A5 and allowing Knight B5. So Stockfish seems to have done the same sort of positional blunder. Is it of great significance that there's a nicely perched knight on B5 in this structure where C6 is unavailable? Does it really matter? We see Bishop F6, which does sometimes try to weaken white on the light squares, perhaps with Bishop G5, trying to take out this bishop on E3, which would leave, in theory, this kind of, in inverted commas, bad bishop on F1. But bad bishops are not always bad. They add solidity, if nothing else, usually to the position in general. Queen D2, we see Bishop H4 tickling a weakness out of white. bishop f6. They're not using a bishop g5 here. There might be f4 anyway. Bishop g2, h4, g4, a4. So if you look at this, Stockfish is playing, it seems, flank moves on both sides of the board. It's visually quite curious, this approach of a4 and h4. Visually very, very curious what's going on here. Is this overly committal? b4, which secures c5. We see knight e5 hitting c4. That's protected. g5. Is this a little bit too committal? Slight downside, surely. We can say b5 visually is a nice square on the light square. But what about f5 here? A knight can sometimes perhaps reroute to f5. And in fact, Leela plays a move which kind of opens up the position. And you might think black's kind of trump out of the opening here is the pressure on e4. So playing f4, is that a little bit controversial? Is there going to be a lot of pressure on the e file? f4 is played, and we see knight g6. It turns out here, g takes, knight takes f4 seems pleasant enough. Even if bishop g5, knight h5, this seems to favour white. This kind of scenario favours white. So we see knight g6, and now rook f1. So not being tempted by f5. f5 might suffer severely sometimes at the hands of knight ef4, with the idea of taking out g2 and blasting through with bishop takes e4. For example, in the worst case, if f takes, which is not forced, knight takes, this is a bad continuation. You can see the queen being lost with check here. But even in this line, instead of f takes, complying with f takes, white could play knight takes, bishop takes, and get a reasonable position, it seems. It's not all disaster. But, yeah, instead of f5, tempting as it might be to us mere mortals, rook f1 was played. G takes, knight takes, bishop g5. And now, well, you might think, well, hold on, there's some captures to consider. Do they do anything here before we get into bishop g5? If knight g takes f4, bishop takes, knight takes, this position is pleasant enough. This is just a fictional continuation, but it seems as though it's pleasant enough. White can do this sort of stuff and even get a kingside attack sometimes, a vicious kingside attack. That's just a fictional game continuation. On the other one, taking on f4, again, it's a pleasant enough position. There's pressure on the king side here. So we see bishop g5, and actually this leads to something very interesting. Knight d5, bishop takes d5, bishop takes g5, and we see bishop takes e4 here. This represents an exchange sacrifice. Stockfish is actually sacking the exchange for a pawn. If queen takes g5, the problem is with this position after c takes is not so much the c7 pawn. That's always going to give black a bit of counterplay. It's this knight rerouting via d4 to f5, in fact. So, for example, this continuation, the knight can eventually swing to f5, and it's going to guarantee white a very nice advantage. On knight takes g5 instead, this position, again, we can see the knight coming potentially to f5 potentially, but also white can play very tactically sometimes like this. This works out in white's favour. So we have bishop takes e4. It represents an exchange sack after bishop takes a8. You might think, isn't this a bit risky with the weakened light squares? Surely Stockfish would not just sacrifice the exchange here in a speculative manner, just one pawn. Check, queen f2, queens come off, and it does seem basically an exchange sack for one pawn. Knight e5, knight c3, rook f8. If knight takes c4, it's nice to just take on f7. There's no problem The rooks can arrange themselves like this and be okay. So that's, and this, there's king h1 to stop the checks, and white will be okay. The black knights cannot do enough damage here. So rook f8, knight d5, king g7. We have knight e3 protecting c4, knight g5 hitting h3. That's protected. King g2, knight g6, rook e1, knight e5, check. And yes, it seems to be a matter of kind of technique here. Rook e3 reinforces h3 here. So one pair of knights coming off, simplifying. It's starting to be clear that white is just the exchange up, basically, for not too much. Starting to clarify. And after taking that, a raw exchange up, not even a pawn. So this does seem now just a matter of technique. So let's just fast forward a bit to see the technique. So on the rooks coming off, we see g5 being offered. Black's king safety would be suffering. g6, pawns offered again by force. On king takes g6, there's check, and the black king's about to be mated in some lines. So that was threatening mate. And this is very difficult. For example, this could lead to a mate. It's very difficult for black's king. So we have g6, f takes, rook e2, and now rook e7. And the game continues a little bit more. So g6 is one. Black's king is very unsafe now. And the queen side's starting to go as well. So it's all over bar the shouting, it seems. Here, actually, it was auto resigned. Both engines thought it was plus 10 for white. So, yeah, an interesting game. Game 88. So by this time, Leela has closed out the match, has won the match. The first neural network in history to win the TCEC Super Final. Stockfish dominant in recent competitions at TCEC for the Super Final, overthrown. And yes, it's just a new breed of superpositional chess, it seems, from the neural networks, which subtle weaknesses. The expression pawns don't go backwards. It's difficult for Stockfish to kind of understand that concept. It's very, very difficult to play against Leela. She can actually exploit weakening pawn moves from a long-term perspective, it seems. So if you enjoyed this game video, please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly, to become a member at chessworld.net, play against other YouTubers. You can also test yourself on the variations covered in this and other game videos from the improved menu puzzle books option, which has a link also to the annotated game. Comments, questions, donations, see the description. Like, share, subscribe with the notification bell. Really appreciated. Thanks very much. Puzzle book addendum. So here is the game we've just looked at, and we can test ourselves on the variations with this. I'm only putting a light filter, clear or mate, here between 1 and 10 here on the moves. So this one, there was a variation here which was interesting with black offering g6. If you remember, that's interesting to bear in mind. So that would justify a lot of Stockfish's play revolving around e4, that variation. So here, white play for a clear advantage. Bishop takes. And here, what was the idea? I think bishop h6, just with a lot of kingside pressure. By the way, there was a threat of knight takes c7 in that position. Maybe I didn't mention that during the main game video for rook takes f6. So the bishop secures itself, but I think even so, was it knight d4? No, okay, what's the hint? Rook f5. Oh, this lets the rook switch to h5. That's another kind of soft white spot in the black position. Can we go to, maybe c3 is more appropriate here than d4? No, d4. Okay. So we take this, and in this line, knight f5. Nope. What was the idea? Rook e1. And I'm not sure what black's doing, particularly knight f5. Yeah, okay, a couple more. They're a bit arbitrary. Okay, so rook takes f7 was possible. Rook f6, trying to avoid getting the rook's fault. There's knight g5. Rook f6 was possible. We could take here. And now here it's important not to play this. There's knight takes g4 and stuff. I think king h1. King h1. Okay, yeah, if you want to check that out. Also, there's a slight improvement, by the way, if you want to check out the puzzle books generally. If you look at this new one, it's a slight spin-off. You can have a look at this. This is Fischer throughout his career. And the slight update here, I think, to make it more educational for any of these Fischer games. It starts off very early in his career and rapidly goes to when he was 16. But the slight spin-off, say you fancy the look of a game when you wondered how he got there. If this is a one where bishop takes c5 was winning, if you scroll down, it will show you the actual game now. You can actually replay the game from the start. So you can see Fischer, when he was 13, was playing a lot this King's Indian attack style system, very positional even back then. So you can see, you get a little bit more insight. He's really smashed the opponent up quite quickly after that positional opening there. Okay, I hope you check that as well. So that's the Fischer Puzzles and Games book course. Okay, thanks very much.